Welcome back to Fresh Outlook. The Senate committee report raises many questions. Among them, how should prisoners be treated? Does enhanced interrogation techniques work? CIA Director John Brennan says it is unknowable whether the so-called interrogation techniques enhance, whether there is a correlation or causation that produced information from prisoners subjected to EITs. Take a look.
Torture tactics out in the open. A former Guantanamo Bay detainee heckled an Australian government minister over his alleged torture at the prison.
What do you have to say?
David Hicks, who was in prison following his 2001 capture in Afghanistan, interrupted Attorney General George Brandis as he spoke at the Human Rights Awards event in Sydney.
This is a vindication of David. It confirms everything that we know, that this was just, frankly, routine and carried out in quite a brutal manner. And David still carries the scars of it today.
David Hicks is not the only one who has openly talked of his torture in the infamous detention center. Mozam Beg said torture tactics are what led to the creation of ISIL.
So, ISIS was born in the dungeons of Abu Ghraib. It was born in the dungeons of the Iraqi prisons that were under US occupation. And that's where this hatred and animosity has festered.
Beg, a British citizen who was detained in Guantanamo Bay for nearly 3 years, said a report into CIA torture does not provide any accountability, despite admitting to torture of terrorism suspects.
We are back live on set here at Fresh Outlook. I am joined by our Ebru think tank, Dr. Alain Sanders, political science professor at St. Peter's University, Jackie Guzda from Western Connecticut University, and Dr. Rob Pallitto from Seton Hall University. His focus is on constitutional law, and I am joined via Skype by Dr. Bart Rossi, political psychologist. Dr. Rossi, I'm going to start with you since you're in the monitor right there. Does torture work in your opinion? You're a psychologist. If somebody is facing a simulation of drowning or being force-fed through their bottom, are they going to give up actionable information, at least in some cases?
Probably not. In most cases, it doesn't work. And here's why. Usually, you get a thread of truth surrounded by information that might be plausible. But at the end of the day, you really don't get much of anything. You get lousy information in most cases. And these psychologists with the CIA, they're licensed psychologists, try to go with a learned helplessness so that these folks who were tortured would eventually give up everything they know, except for one thing. Research says that it really doesn't work that well. You just get a little bit of information that might be valid, and in most cases, even if you believe it, it's stuff that isn't correct. So it really is not a good way to go. It's not effective. And then there's one more point that I want to make. There are people who are vested in this trying to make it work, trying to make it believe that torture works because they want to be tough on terror. And that brings in the whole psychology of a Dick Cheney or even some Democrats who want to be tough and they want to believe that it works when in fact it doesn't.
All right, Dr. Rossi, let's turn now to Jackie Guzda. Jackie, tell me a little bit about mass media and how it influences our opinions. I'm talking about 24. When all of this was happening, Jack Bauer was out there torturing people to get information, and a lot of people, it was a #1 show for a long time, were cheering him on as he did it. Do you see any correlation at all in public opinion, torture, the role of TV shows like 24, and this report we have before us?
Massive correlation. People believe what they see. When they see dramatizations like 24 or Zero Dark 30, when Jessica Chastain was putting her head in her hands and she heard the cries of the torturers and all of that, yeah, people believe that that is real. So you look at now, we don't have any images from this current torture. All we have is this 6,000-page report. So we hear words. We see politicians talking about it. So people believe those images that they see in the movies and on television. I'll give you a point in case. Pew Research Center just found out that 53% of the American public that they polled believed the torturing was a good thing. But back in Abu Ghraib, when we have those horrific pictures, the dog leash, Lindy England with her foot on the prisoner, and all of that, nobody, I mean, the numbers were down in the 20s, believed that torturing was a good thing.
So if it's an abstract, you're for it. If you actually see the pictures, you're against it.
In essence,
Okay.
yeah, that's the power of the image.
Alan, what are your thoughts on what Jackie's saying?
I think she's absolutely correct. There's plenty of evidence that when people actually see, feel, experience what is going on, they react differently than when they're told about it in a cold, printed record version of the event. And so I think that the media has kind of made us used to this, to violence in general, and so that it tends to lower our moral outrage and our moral bearings. But I would carry out and go a little further than you and pick up on something I said before. The war against terrorism is as much a military war as a war of images and propaganda. And anyone in their right mind who thought that torturing these very despicable people, by the way, and that's something we tend to forget, these most of them, not all of them, but most of them were despicable terrorists, and turning them into kind of heroes by virtue of the fact that we have used and martyrs, by virtue of the fact that we use these horrible techniques, is a great disadvantage to us and a great error that we have committed. And going forward, since we were speaking about it in the last segment, going forward, I think this will damage the U.S. credibility. This will damage the U.S. Foreign policy, and that should be taken into account in the in the whole history of this situation. The fact that we have hurt ourselves and hurt ourselves very badly on the world scene.
And Rob, in fact, California Senator, U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein has called this a stain on America. Do you agree it's a stain on America? And what are the ramifications you see from this report?
Well, I do agree. Unfortunately, this is not the first time that even this information has come to light. In early 2009, some of the information that's talked about in the report was released about waterboarding, about walling, about stress positions, and some other things. So it is a stain. My concern is that people won't get as concerned this time, again, because it's not accompanied by images. In fact, the report talks, ironically enough, about how the CIA destroyed some of the videotape of interrogations for the precise reason that Jackie says, because images have this sort of visceral effect on us. So yeah, I mean, I have looked through U.S. history about similar events, similar actions by the U.S. government, and how they were talked about as a contradiction of our principles, as a stain on our history. It's happened. Whether people will remain interested is a concern that we have. And I guess I hope that people will look at specifically what officials knew, what they told other people, how they obstructed investigations. I mean, there was a claim made by a few people that releasing this report was going to make America less safe, which is kind of absurd because there isn't anything new about what we did. Again, the report talks more about what was covered up. That's not the kind of thing that's going to galvanize people into violent action against the United States the way that, say, photographs might. But it is information that can help us to say reform is needed, oversight is needed. I mean, right after 9/11, people were angry, people were frightened. There was a tremendous pull towards let's do something strong, let's do something decisive. And I think people weren't vigilant enough and also didn't know what was actually being done.
Dr. Rossi joining us via Skype. Is the need for revenge, is the need for getting even, did that fuel in part, in your opinion, some of these interrogation techniques that were used and had officials turning a blind eye and perhaps in some cases the public applauding it?
I don't think it's really revenge. I really don't believe it's that. I think it's because they believe that it would be effective. And I think the politics is that there are folks who want it to be effective even though it's not. And the politics comes into this because people want to be tough on terror and they want to project themselves that way. And that's a big part of this problem. And this is why it's going to remain a stain on us.
Doctor, you bring out an interesting point. It's about being counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to think that torture does not work. It's hard to convince a lot of people that torture doesn't work, because if their life is in jeopardy or perceived to be in jeopardy, or their loved ones' lives are in jeopardy or perceived to be in jeopardy, you would think at that point a suspect would cooperate.
Well, you might think that, but there's a lot of things in psychology where you may think one way, but it's really not going down that road. And this is one of them. And again, as I said before, there's a thread of truth that you may get, but it's mixed with so many other factors that it ends up being meaningless in most cases. And that's where the problem is, and that's where the denial comes in from those on the extreme right in most cases who want to believe it and they want to talk tough on terror.
Jackie, turning to you as our media expert, what do you think of the coverage of the release of this report so far? The reportage we have seen, the analysis we have seen, has it been fair? Has it been heavy-handed towards the Bush-Cheney administration? What are your thoughts?
I think they've given both sides, if you want to divide this into sides, unfortunately. They've given them their due. Dick Cheney made the rounds. He was, giving his black and white, uncritical reasons. Yes, we have to torture. Yes, we got pertinent information. And then you had the other sides, like Dr. Bart was just saying, it's like, wait a minute, slow down. Does torture really give us that pertinent information that we need? And so I think both sides have played out. Problem is that it's only talk right now. It's only the talking heads, and only 600 pages came out of that 6,000-page report. I think it opened the conversation, but I hope we don't stop it now. I hope that in this 24/7 news cycle, something else takes its place, and then, and then we lose it. We've got to talk about this.
I want to talk to you, Alan, about something. Mm-hmm. One of your hats you've worn in life is that of a journalist.
Right.
A number of journalists have been waterboarded as a demonstration. To me, that kind of says something about the technique that, one, it's not that bad or nobody would subject themselves to it. At least some people feel that way. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, journalists will subject themselves to many things in order to make a point. So I wouldn't rely on that as much of anything. But we do have what the report says about people who were waterboarded. One of the inmates was waterboarded, and the people who watched this process were crying. The actual CIA officers were crying and upset and wired back to headquarters, I don't want to participate in this kind of activity anymore.
It's sort of like witnessing an execution.
Right,
I've been offered the role to do that, and I say no thanks. I don't care if he's a child killer. I don't want to see somebody fried in an election
Exactly.
chair.
So you have the people who actually witnessed this event being so repulsed by it that they're actually writing back to headquarters that we don't want to do this anymore. So that actually tells you the level of torture that was involved here. Moreover, many of these people lost consciousness, lost all sense of reality, and picking up on what Dr. Bart said, how can you find information produced by people who lose all sense of reality because of the extreme torture and pain that they are undergoing? How can you treat that as reliable information? That makes no sense.
Rob, one of the issues that comes up during this conversation, I haven't heard it mentioned much, is the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention prohibiting the use of these types of extreme techniques. The problem with that in my mind is, and the mind of others is, you're dealing with rogue groups that don't adhere to these Geneva Conventions either. So again, getting back to the point, perhaps you have to fight fire with fire. At least a lot of people might say that.
Well, the thing about the Geneva Conventions is they are conventions, so they're not the same kind of law as, let's say, the criminal prohibition against torture in U.S. law. So when it comes to enforcing them, and we saw sometimes courts were reluctant to take a claim of a Geneva Convention right and honor it in U.S. courts. I mean, I have an opinion about that, but that's sort of beside the point. The point is that the Geneva Conventions set standards that countries are supposed to adhere to, and they are supposed to adhere to those standards no matter whom they're addressing or whom they're treating or whom they're interrogating. So that's one issue. But in the United States, after we signed the Geneva Conventions, after we signed the Convention Against Torture in the 80s, which is a lot more specific about what constitutes torture and what can't be done, we also created a federal law that said this is how we interpret the prohibition against torture, and we've made it a federal crime. So, I mean,
so we're going to see if any prosecutions come out of this. That'll be interesting.
Well, they probably won't. don't. I mean, the Obama administration has said we're looking forward, not backward, and we want to reform things. And when Obama came into office, he made a new standard for interrogation, which prohibited coercive interrogation. So I don't see that happening, although I think it should. I think agency reform, legislative reform is more likely, and I'm hopeful about that.
I got to hold you there because it's up against a break. When we come back, a $1.1 trillion spending plan gets a thumbs up in Congress. Of course, we want to thank our guest, Dr. Bart Rossi, who joined us via Skype. Thanks for that. And we'll have a whole lot more after this.